welcome to all of you to the Verdis Leadership Series, which is goes from strength to strength. And I can't remember quite how many we've done now, but we must have done 10, and we've been doing them for the last 2 years.
I think we're on 15 or 16 actually.
And I mean, we've had a terrific time, and we continue to have a terrific time meandering around leadership topics, which are so close to all of our hearts. And we've tackled from all sorts of different leadership to the drama triangle to many different things. And last time we were fortunate enough to have Charlotte come along, and we're going to hear from Charlotte again. But first of all, I'd like to get Natalie just to welcome everyone. Natalie, who's our great friend, and maybe you'd just welcome everyone to the Verdis Leadership Series.
Yes, lovely to see you all. I mean, I think we are all happy to maybe start getting out and meeting people for real, you know, rather than digitally. Well, you know, the webinar series carry on nonetheless, because I think it's quite a nice way to talk about topics that otherwise are not really tackled in many conferences, and you know, so people are loyal, and we think that we are doing a good service. And Charlotte has kindly accepted to be leading the second series on board, on what makes a good board. And I'm very happy that she's here, and I'm welcoming everybody with great pleasure.
Thank you, Natalie. And fantastic to see Natalie. And I mean, we started off, I'd like, Charlotte can introduce herself in a second, but we started off with a nice juicy topic, which Charlotte gave us an introduction to last time, what is the purpose of a board? And she introduced me to this wonderful thing, which is, I think it's called NIFO, which is nose in, fingers out, which is this concept that boards should be curious and ask searching questions, but shouldn't get there and try and micromanage. And from my own experience, NIFO is one of the most complex things to get right, because and I think boards, effective boards don't have real conflict in, but lots of boards have massive conflict in. And we asked Charlotte, because we enjoyed it so much, to come back and give us like part 2. So today I'm gonna talk to Charlotte, and then afterwards we're gonna move into a few breakouts, and as we normally do, sort of get closer in proximity and meet each other and tackle a few issues, and then we're gonna come back. So that's our format. And today's topic, I think, is particularly pertinent, really, which is founders and boards. Founders and boards. And on that note, I'd ask Charlotte maybe to introduce herself and start weaving her thinking about founders and boards. Charlotte, welcome.
Oh, thank you. It's my honor and pleasure. Charlotte Sibley, and I spent my career almost entirely in biotech, pharma bio, building groups, in analytics and insights groups, marketing research, competitive intelligence. I built the first CI group in the industry at Squibb, and strategic forecasting, decision science, all the analytics, insights, research groups to make fact-based decisions in this industry, which for some companies was quite a change, rather than gut decisions. And had the opportunity to work with research and development a lot, as well as commercialization. A bunch of companies, Pharmacia, Bristol Myers Squibb, then in biotech at Millennium, and my last corporate position was at Shire, where I built the groups and then had the job of my life running leadership development for a couple of years, which was really terrific. And went from there on to a public board. And the last 10, 11 years I've served on public boards, private boards, advisory boards. They're all different. In some ways, they're all, as Annika says, starts off, all good companies are alike, all not so good companies are different in their own way. And all boards have similarities and some differences. So maybe we just jump right into the topic of founders, because the current board that I'm on was indeed a founder company, and I'll get to that a little bit later, but I'll talk a little bit about the history and just a little bit of the background. So if Maggie will maybe put up the slides, if you wouldn't mind. I have just a few. They're my little notes. Thank you. And I'm not great at this, so thank you, Maggie, for doing this.
I think we need number
So if
one.
we could go back to the.
Can you go back to one? That's it. That's it.
We go. Okay, so that's the official title. Are they good? Or, well, in some ways, yes. And certainly the board that I'm on now, Advi Sen, was founded by an MD, PhD, who was chairman of the board, CEO. And I think he epitomized a founder, his knowledge and experience. There was no one, he was a psychiatrist, neurologist. There was no one who knew that space better than he. Certainly none of the board members and even some of the people hired. And I think that is one of the things that founders bring. They do it because they have an idea, they have knowledge, they have experience. I think the other thing that they have, which is remarkable, is their persistence and passion. I have a nephew who started a company called Nosin. Think Purell for your nose. It stops the nasal carriage from shedding, and companies like all major hospital systems in the US are using it now. They used it in Korea to stop the spread of SARS. It, for the physicians and nurses, it stops the spread of infection by about 99%. It's been 17 years since he developed it, and it took 15 years for the company finally to take off. That's a long time. And to support a family and all of that, the persistence and passion that founders bring is truly remarkable, at oftentimes great cost, physical, emotional, financial to themselves. And oftentimes, because of their experience and passion, their ability to get early funding can be significant. They can get funding that other people cannot, either from their connections in the industry or because of their reputation and the charisma with which they present their idea, because they usually do have charisma, and it does have to be inspiring. When I was interviewed by the CEO founder of Advi Sen, my current French board, who by the way is no longer, that's a longer story, no longer CEO, chairman of the board, but his first words to me as we met at a restaurant in New York City was, "I want to build a company for the patients, not for the shareholders." He had me at those words. I said, that's the kind of company I want to be involved in. That's the charisma, the inspiration, the persistence. So those are the attributes that a founder brings. However, do they not make good ones because of what's been labeled founder's syndrome? They sometimes think that he or she, they think that they can do everything very well and better than anybody on the board, sometimes even better than some of their employees. I've seen that in action. And they may be packing the board with friends, colleagues, even relatives, as was the case in 2 of my boards. People who will not disagree with them, who will not have any opposing views, because they don't want to hear any. And if they do hear any, they don't listen to them, or they try to get people off the board who have a different idea from theirs. The sense of wanting to control everything. I've seen the instance of a spoke and hub, where a hub and spoke, where the CEO founder is the hub, everybody else is a spoke. There's no teamwork. He or she controls everything out at the margins, at the edges, but there's no collaboration. And that makes sure that he or she stays in control because he or she is the only person who knows everything. And I think another factor is oftentimes staying too long. I have seen that at a number of companies. Even Mark Levin, bless him, serial entrepreneur who started Millennium, said he probably stayed too long at Millennium. So that can be an issue. So I think maybe we'll stop here and maybe some questions, or Tony has some comments, I think.
No, I would just say, Charlotte, I mean, one of the things in our world is not only their boldness, if you like, the founder, because they're scientists, often they have an intrinsic quality which creates a academic style of culture. I mean, have you experienced this? Do you know what I'm talking about?
I have heard of it. It was not so much my case because they had already been in other companies where they commercialized products. But I know at Millennium at the beginning, it was just a research company, and then it was transitioning to a development company. And when I joined, it was becoming a commercialized company. The problem was with, I think, a serial entrepreneur at the top. I always described Millennium as when I joined, a collection of, I was the 11th vice president hired in commercial, and we had sales of about $30 million and launching another product. And I described it as a collection of people who were so passionate and dedicated, but some were doing the cha-cha and some were doing the tango and some were snowboarding. And it was really, unfortunately, dysfunctional. And I think the sense was indeed from the academic science, anybody could weigh in on anything at any time. And the first strategic planning meeting that I went to, the deck was 178 pages, and it was like a graduate course in cardiovascular biochemistry. Yeah. And I thought, we've got some problems here. I think yes.
I absolutely empathize with that. I think the other thing, just as a reflection, I mean, if you take the companies I was CEO with, actually, if you look maybe back 14, 15 years, that's been a long journey for these companies. And during that long journey of 15 years, often the founders are having different impact at different places along that 15 years. And I suppose my question to you is one of the no's about founders is actually they create limiting beliefs. They hold on to technology for too long. So that one of the things is they were great advocates, as you say, as a yes, you know, they're great people, but actually there's a point that comes that they need to forget that technology because the company needs to pivot. And I suppose, you know, one of my things is that sometimes the technology was an excuse to start a company, but actually very quickly the company was not really interested in that technology.
And that it can indeed happen. That happened to one of the advisory boards that I was on with a learning development software, and it just wasn't. It just wasn't making it. The education in the workplace had moved on, and very little is done through formal training now. Most people on the job learn on the job, or they learn from colleagues. Only 10% is through formal learning. And I think it was really hard, unless you're in compliance or some very specific things, it was very hard for the founder to walk away from that. And Tony, I think you and I and Maggie talked before that that's part of the staying too long and having a non-aligned strategy, because suddenly the board and the CEO are in different places. And that's one of the real issues.
But because there's no, you know, because a lot of companies like the founder companies start with one sense of purpose. You know, I want freedom away from academic research. I want freedom. That's the reason they've started it. But then all of a sudden in comes some investors who say, well, I'm here to make money out of this. And those really create tension, Charlotte. Is that how you've experienced it?
Absolutely. I used to call it the University of Squibb or the University of Taconic or Millennium, because that was it. That's wonderful. The research is critical, but we were also there to essentially to make a profit. And even, I'm not from the Milton Friedman school of just the shareholders. I'm from the school of Johnson & Johnson for all the stakeholders. And we had a responsibility to patients and to employees and patients. And sometimes then the science just wasn't, it may be interesting, but as one physician said to me, you've given me the solution to a problem that I don't have. And that's where, from an academic point of view, it's very interesting, but it was a commercial no-go.
Yeah. So moving on, Charlotte, to your American Pacific example.
Okay. So I went, this was unusual that I went directly onto a public board and not from the C-suite. I was a senior vice president, but there was a proxy fight, and there were 5 investors who got together, and they had a majority of the shares and said, if you don't put someone on the board who understands the largest issue, the largest area, which was the active pharmaceutical ingredient area, we're going to launch a proxy fight. The company also made solid rocket fuel and water treatment. It was a public company, but it was run like a private family-owned company. It had been, and you could tell. The CEO was also the chairman of the board, and he was the 2nd generation. His father had founded the firm. His brother was on the board. His brother owned the patents, and his sister was the corporate secretary and the head of HR. And they had 3 friendlies on the board: a former astronaut, the wife of a former astronaut, 2 family friends. It was really a very dysfunctional in many ways board. So I and another fellow who were, we were both from the pharma industry, were elected to the board to avoid a proxy fight. And the first board meeting, you could see everybody sat there looking at us. Who are these people who have been foisted upon us? We're not happy about that. Gradually, however, we were able to bring the board to a place where there was some alignment, and some of it was via making sure we met with other members of the board regularly, asking a lot of questions. I think it became clear that we were not there for our own agenda, we were there for the board's agenda. And after the initial, why are you here, within a couple of board meetings, we were hearing, make sure Bart is on this committee, make sure Charlotte's on that committee. And making sure that we were trying to bring them to better governance, really pushing for an independent lead director, and having executive meetings at the end of our board meetings. That hadn't been done, and everybody attended all the committee meetings, comp and all of that. It was really
My question, Charlotte, is, I mean, one of the things is time, isn't it? So, I mean, if you were, you know, you went on there and you were effectively a catalyst for change. That's really what you were. And I suppose my question is if we put time into that calculation, how long and how gentle were you in your change actions? Because some companies, you think, well, if I don't put in my full force into this, these things won't change for years. And I suppose my question is as that catalyst for change, as a non-exec on it, do you put 2% effort in and let it roll over 5 years, or do you put 80% effort in and try and sort it in 6 months?
Well, I think it depends upon the culture of the board, how many people there are on the board who shouldn't be on the board, and what the magnitude of that is going to be. I think Bart and I would travel to Las Vegas together, and we talk a lot, going and with a couple of other board members who were like-minded, and said there are certain things. This was a, what hills are we going to die on today? Here are certain things we have to do. We need to have a compensation committee meeting that is private, that everybody, that was fairly quickly that we instituted that. We have to have solid financial information. We need to make sure that we don't have binders that are 150 pages of extraneous material. So there were a few things right up front that we said, we're really asking for this. And I think knowing there was never a quote threat, but knowing that we were put on the board to avoid a proxy fight, I think that helped a little bit. Quite frankly, I think if we had had more than quarterly meetings, it would have been faster. The boards that I'm on now, we have monthly check-ins, and I think that's a lot more conducive to sustaining change, to having quicker change and sustaining it. Every 3 months, it's hard because it takes a while just to get geared up again. And I think that was one of the learnings for me, that if change has to happen, it has to be, you can't be meeting once every 3 months.
Yeah. Moving on to Taconic.
Yep, Taconic, yep. And it was a very similar situation. This is a company that was genetically engineered mice and rats for clinical trials. Actually, mice went to space in one of the last launches. It was pretty cool. Again, private, family owned and operated. And when I joined the board, the CEO was also the chairman of the board, and he happened to be Gen 3. And he was the third of 3 brothers who had been head of the company. 3 other family members on the board, and several family members were employees, and 3 longtime friendlies were on the board too. So very, very similar. Declining revenues sparked an independent CEO search, and the CEO wasn't thrilled about it, but it was clear because of the family foundation, it was clear they might lose everything, and the family voted for a CEO search. And I think within about 36 minutes of hiring the new CEO, we realized that we were in a turnaround, not a transition. And that really sparked a lot of significant change, with the comment being there's no long term without the short term. And several of the board members kept talking about the microbiome and mice in space. And we realized we were never going to get there if we didn't do an immediate turnaround. And that precipitated a massive change in the board. All the family members were voted off, except for one who had been only peripherally involved, and she became chair of the board, and 3 friendlies, and only one other man and I were retained on the board. And then we could really start to make some changes, and similarly turn the company around and make it appropriate for acquisition.
This is another fascinating thing, that you say the CEO came in as a turnaround and said it was a turnaround, not a transition. By and large, my experience is almost any new C-suite comes in, that happens because you've got the glass half full phenomena get squashed. And that's another issue with the founder, that they perpetuate the glass half full. And but also I sometimes worry that the new CEO can't see the strength of the founder because they want to sweep a new broom in, to mix my metaphors in up. What's your thoughts on that?
That is always the balance. I think in this case, what precipitated the conversation that several of us on the board had while the other person left is, how did we not know some of this stuff? And what were the questions we should have been asking? That was quite a soul searching that we did, because had we known some of these things, we would have recognized that it was more a turnaround than a transition. And somebody coming in who knew exactly where to look and what to look for. And I think he certainly did imbue the family values. That was one of the things we made sure when we hired him. But he was not going to sacrifice family values for the sake of not doing the things that had to be done for the business. And let me tell you one thing that was done that absolutely shocked us. We found that the euthanization rate of mice was close to 50% at times. And I remember saying, what? Well, it's because the CEO felt that this was like Walmart with SKUs. You had to have every single strain of mice available for anybody who called and be able to ship them in 24 hours.
Mm.
Well, these are living creatures. And we were dealing with compassion fatigue for the lab techs who were having to euthanize these mice. You can grow a colony of mice in 6 weeks. And most companies, obviously the major strains, but that kind of thing, and it just sat there and said, how did we not know this? So I think those were some of the things that indicated to us that there were things that were grossly wrong at the foundation, and therefore a turnaround, and a lot of that stuff that had to be completely done. But still keeping, it wasn't just the CEO's vision, it was the family. We were lucky that the family foundation had this code of ethics essentially. And we looked at it and read it every single board meeting and made sure that we kept we kept, you know, on top of those, kept true to those. So I think that helped. You're right. Otherwise, because if somebody comes in and they just want to put their own mark on it, we didn't think he was that type of person when we hired him, and we were right. He did what was right for the company.
Now, one question, I mean, because I think you and I resonate because we're both sort of independent non-execs. So one of the questions is, as an independent non-exec, you come in as a helper, Charlotte. And I suppose my question is how do you really build the relationships up so that you're not in one camp or the other?
When we first came onto the board in American Pacific, because Bart and I would come out the day before, of course, traveling, we would make sure we had dinner with one board member and breakfast with another board member. And over the course of several, and if we could at lunch, sit next to yet a third person. If there were a dinner, a fourth person. So over the course of several board meetings, even though they were every quarter, we did feel that we got to know several people. And because he and I were aligned, we could branch out and work with some of the same people, with different people on ourselves. The same with Taconic. I would make sure every time I went up there, they were in Hudson, New York, meet with different people. I started mentoring people suggested by the CEO who were a couple of levels down. That helped me. That helped me build relationships. I heard the tone at the top from all of our meetings. This gave me the mood of the middle, and these people were running the operations, and they gave insight into the buzz at the bottom, if you will, and that helped me build relationships too. A lot of it is just taking the time and getting to know them as people too, not just board members.
Where, Charlotte, does the chairman play? Which place are they in the game here?
I would always try to meet with the chairman individually, if not even for 10 minutes, or have a conversation before or after. Some boards, the chair is very good about calling every board member before a meeting and prefacing them. I haven't been on those boards, but now we're usually having a prep call. I have a board meeting at Advicen in France next week, and we've had some prep calls and conversations, and that helps. The chair should be absolutely involved in making sure that he or she has a relationship with every board member.
Interesting. Charlotte, I think this is fantastic substrate to get hold of as a biologist, and fantastic, and thank you so much. We're going to move, I think, to our next phase. Maggie, if we leave up the question, can we leave the question?
Do you want to? We've got some questions in the chat box. So do you want to take?
I think maybe we should go straight into our group. Get the juices rolling.
Okay.
Come back to some questions. So do you want to bring up those questions, and maybe
Sure.
Charlotte, you could just in your words phrase it,
Sure.
and because we're going to split the folks into little groups, it gives you a chance to build your own rapport up, and you know, organize, sort of think about these things. So Charlotte, could you just your voice say these two things, please?
Sure. So have you seen founder syndrome on any of your boards? And if so, how did you or the board handle it? Or it sometimes not even a founder, but a longtime CEO who is so identified with the company that the same dysfunction can occur. And if so, one of the questions was, when do you walk away? Well, that might be one option. I was too naive, I think, on my first board. I kept thinking I could, you know, make a difference, and kept staying, and ultimately did. But I think you walk away when it's ethical or legal or financial real concerns. But other than that, for founder syndrome, how did you handle it? Or an autocratic CEO?
Fantastic. So Charlotte, let's just thank Charlotte. We'll get a chance to thank Charlotte again, but we're going to get the first one in now.